Hello, class, and welcome to my lecture on Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell. First of all, I want to just warn you that this is going to be a lecture, and it's probably my first and longest lecture that you will have from me. So, just this one time, you need to listen to me talk for about an hour. So, I encourage you to pause the video if you need to after about 10 minutes or so. Just get everybody's attention back, and we will just suffer through this together. My children are sick, which is why I'm not there today, and believe me, I would rather be with you than changing diarrhea diapers. My little girl has gone through 10 changes of clothes in 3 days, and just as many showers, if not more, and my little boy is starting to do it too, so not fun. But anyway, one thing that is fun is talking about Bertrand Russell. Because of short notice also, usually I have some kind of visual aid, like um, a YouTube uh, PowerPoint presentation, something like that. But because of the very short notice, I was only able to study for the lecture, and so that's what you're going to get. I also want you to take out a pen and a piece of paper and take notes, because every syllable that I utter today is important and it might be on the exam. So please pay attention and take notes. Should be very easy for you because most of this material you've read before. You've probably read it more than once. And this is just going to be review for many of you. So just take notes, and I will grade your notes whenever I come back on Tuesday. So I'm going to wait for you to just give you a second to get everything together. Okay, why are we studying Bertrand Russell? Bertrand Russell is a very famous philosopher. He maybe achieves rock star status. He's like one of the philosophers that people will consult and get his opinion on. He was a great humanitarian, and he graduated from Cambridge, wrote a lot of books, and this is one of his wildly popular lectures. Um, we're primarily doing this to practice identifying arguments and analyzing them. So I wanted to give you a master, not somebody who is running for political office and uh, just spouting off stuff, or people on the news that aren't any good at arguing, and they just, they're full of fallacies and all this other stuff. He's a master at the argument. He's not a novice. When he gave this lecture, he had been a Cambridge professor for a very long time, and he had many other books. Um, so his arguments are going to be very good, and you might not even find, even though you know that he's wrong, and you know you disagree with him, you might not be able to find any fallacies. And if you do find a fallacy, it's going to be not part of his argument, but like an offhanded comment, which is perfectly fine whenever you're irritated with a certain point of view. He can insult you. That's as long as it's not part of the argument, it's not a logical fallacy. But we're not going to do that because we're above that kind of thing. And so that's what we're doing it. Number one, to practice identifying and analyzing argument. That's the most important thing that we're doing. Okay, so the second thing is you really need to practice listening to someone, paying attention to someone that you might not agree with, and hearing arguments that might make you angry or at least not willing to listen. Now, if you really read Bertrand Russell and you listen to what he has to say, it's probably going to make you a little uncomfortable at first, because you might be in an environment where everybody likes Christianity and everybody believes it, and you may have experienced Christianity positively your whole life. I have a background very similar to all of you. I grew up in the church, and whenever I went to college, I was very surprised to find people that didn't have a positive experience with Christianity. And by that I mean they didn't grow up in a church around with people that love them in the name of Jesus, and they just didn't care about anything that the church had to say. So you're going to encounter people like that once you graduate and get out into the world. So you need to be prepared to listen. And if you listen, you can be a better witness. You can be a less offensive Christian. And by less offensive, I mean, sometimes we just rub people the wrong way. And if we listen to people, maybe we can be a little bit more sensitive and not come across arrogant or not come across dumb. There are things that you can do and say after you listen to someone's complaints, or if you listen to someone's compliments, you can better yourself. So even with somebody like Bertrand Russell, who might be, very offensive, um, he has something to tell us, and so that's the second reason. First reason is you need to practice identifying and analyzing arguments. And I think it's very important for you to listen to someone that you might not agree with. That's reason number two. Reason number three, um, we need to learn how to get along with people. It's very important that we listen to other people and we learn how to get along with them. This is a very big problem in our country right now. I don't know if you realize this, but every president, George W. Bush, he was elected twice, and then Obama was elected twice. That's the past four elections. Okay, in every one of those elections, we found out that um, the country is divided, almost 50-50 on the very basic, most important issues. And what people like to do is fight. Fight about everything. And if we learn to listen to someone we disagree with, we can learn how to get along with each other. We can find a middle ground, and at the very least, we can talk to each other without yelling at each other and getting all upset. And that's the key, because we are learning how to argue and reason logically. There's no reason to be angry with anybody, and there's every reason to listen. You can only benefit when you listen to someone. And that benefit may be that you don't need to listen to them anymore. But most of the time, if someone wants to make progress, if two people want to understand something, for example, or if two people want to work together to some end, it benefits both parties to listen and say something constructive. So that is the fourth reason. We need to learn how to get along with people. So you should have a entry in your notes that says, why are we studying this? We need to practice identifying and analyzing arguments. We need to practice listening to someone we might not agree with. Number three, we need to learn how to get along with people. And how do we get along with people? Listen. And the benefit of all of this is being a better Christian. If we can be a Christian without being jerks, or be a Christian without pretending that we know everything, or simply be a Christian that listens. Jesus would listen to people and interact with people. He wasn't always happy with what people had to say, but he listened. So that's the most important thing, and that's where my message to you about Bertrand Russell comes into play. I learned how to listen to him and listen to his arguments against Christianity, and it helps me to talk to people about why they should be a Christian. You can kind of turn it around a little bit. So let's get into Bertrand Russell. Entry in your notes: who is Bertrand Russell? He has a very odd name. I remember him at like Bert and Ernie. Bert, Bert, and then Rand, Bertrand, R Bert, Bertrand, and then Russell with two S's and two L's. So Bertrand Russell, great name. He is a British philosopher. He just sits around, looks at the clouds all day, and comes up with philosophies. He was the most influential philosopher of the 20th century that spoke English. So, how do you know if somebody is influential? Well, people listen to him. He made um, incredible leaps in philosophy. With the philosophy of mathematics and he came up with the idea and developed the idea of the logical basis for mathematics. That math is more logic based than just numbers. I mean, that's obvious to us now, but it hasn't been so obvious in the past. So he also helped found something called analytical philosophy, and that's where you attack the language of your opponent and to break apart their argument. And it's not semantics. It's the philosophy of language. So, um, very influential guy, and you can tell he was born in 1890, so he was around for the First World War. He became a professor at Cambridge in 1910, and as you know, World War I was about that time. And in 1950, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his humanitarian writings and freedom of thought. So he is a widely recognized guy. And the humanitarian effort that he did was he's most remembered by his pacifism and his argument against nuclear proliferation. Nuclear proliferation is more and more countries developing the atomic bomb. So he was against the arms race. Whenever Russia and America were struggling to get more nukes than each other, he was very against the use of the atomic bomb for humanitarian reasons. He thought it was immoral that we wanted to kill each other. So he was visionary in that respect because the Christian countries, Britain and America, for example, couldn't get enough of them. So that was one of his criticisms that you're going to see in the book. So 18. These are some dates you need to know. Only three of them. 1890, he enters Cambridge. He starts as a student. 1895, 5 years later, he becomes a fellow, which is basically it's kind of like your master's degree in America. And then in 1910, he becomes a lecturer, which is like a PhD professor. So it's just a little different back then, or a little bit different titles in Cambridge. He had a very long career. I just gave you four dates. I'm sorry. You only need to know 1890, entering Cambridge. 1910, he became a lecturer. 1950, he wins the Nobel Prize. So he's active for the First World War and the Second World War. Why is that important? Okay, in the First World War, you have death at just unbelievable numbers. There was never anything like World War One, and just because of the amount of deaths in the battles, hundreds of thousands of men dying in one place, just for a hill or something like that. So that changed theology. Theologians had to ask the question: how can God be good with all of this human suffering? And it is pretty dramatic how it affected everybody, and it affects us even now. Um, and then you have World War II, which of course had the Holocaust. And I don't know if you know this, but about 36 million people died, just Russians, under Stalin. That's World War II plus all of the famines and stuff like that that happened afterwards. 36 million people just from one country, and 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, and then all the other deaths, and then the atomic bomb. I mean, we're talking significant problems for people like Christians, especially Christian leaders, who want to say that God is good, and God even exists after all this catastrophe. Um, it's a problem that we're still struggling with today, but this is so fresh. Whenever he wins the Nobel Prize in 1950, it's only 5 years after the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. So it's pretty remarkable how that affected everybody. So so that's Bertrand Russell. 1890, entered Cambridge. 1910, became a lecturer. 1950, wins the Nobel Prize. And in between that, he had a long career writing important philosophical works. You need to know that he basically founded analytical philosophy, which is attacking the language of your opponent, mathematics, logic of mathematics, and the philosophy of language. If you think about it, philosophy of language is like, what exactly is it? What exactly does language do? What do words signify? It gets into epistemology, the origin of the word and how it affects the argument. And he does that a little bit in this essay. And then, okay, so that's it. He's the most influential English philosopher of the 20th century. Okay, now, where do we begin with this? Excuse me just a second. Okay, philosophy, this is another entry in your notes. Philosophy and Christianity. This is something we need to talk about before we read a modern philosopher on Christianity. I don't know what you've been told in the past, so I wish I could ask you so I know where to begin. But I'm just going to have to begin at the beginning. That is the beginning of Christianity. There are philosophers that wrote about Christianity. All of them, and this is important, all of the philosophers in the 2nd and 3rd century who encountered Christianity and wrote about it, and that we have, all of them ridicule Christianity. Not one philosopher who encounters Christianity, as it's fresh, in the first 300 years, there's not one philosopher that accepts it. Now, there are Christians who say that they are philosophers. Justin Martyr, in about 150, became a Christian, and he says that he liked philosophy, but he wasn't a philosopher. He was kicked out of several different philosophical schools. He went from school to school, looking for whatever it is that he was doing, and he never really committed to a school and became a teacher and became active in philosophy. Now, whenever he became a Christian, he did have some background in the philosophical schools. So Justin Martyr might be, might be an exception, but the problem is he was a Christian. So let's say it like this: every non-Christian philosopher that we know of that encountered Christianity rejected it and ridiculed it. So that's something you need to know. But there's a long relationship between Christianity and philosophy. You know that Christianity came out of Judaism, and the other side of that coin is that Christianity wanted, Paul wanted to unite Judaism and Gentiles, and the way that he did that is he used Greek and Roman philosophy. He did not pattern, he did not write philosophy. The letters are not that Paul wrote are not philosophy, but they espouse moral, and this is important. They espouse the moral teachings of some philosophers, but not the the teachings of the philosophical school. For example, Platonism, the teachings of Plato espoused certain ideas about God and a certain methodology to learn it, and it's called the Platonic method. So you have to accept a whole lot of philosophical tenets and do the work of philosophy and come up with the Platonic idea of God. What Paul did was he took the moral teachings of a philosophy, which is, what is good and what is bad. You know, um, One thing that's good is wives submitting to their husbands. That's a moral teaching. But it didn't have all of the other things. Like Plato, for example, thought that, and Timaeus, his work Timaeus, he thought that everybody first originated. God first created everyone as male and female together, and then somehow we got split and into male and female, and we need to find our mate and become one again. That's in Timaeus. Okay, Paul did not accept that, but he did teach the same thing that Plato taught about wives submitting to husbands. So the moral teachings, right and wrong, he accepted. The philosophy he did not accept. Usually, he did. Paul did employ certain little tidbits here and there, but he did not adopt a philosophical school of thinking. So that's a very important distinction. So Paul's not a philosopher, but he uses a little bit of moral philosophy. So that's the relationship between that's the origin of the relationship between Christianity and philosophy. Paul uses some of their moral teachings. Now, Jesus doesn't. Jesus is about bringing in the Jews. Paul is about bringing in Gentiles. So, now that we know that, also in Luke, Paul, of course, argues against the philosophers in the Acropolis, and so he knows a little bit about different philosophies, and he's able to argue against them. So, that's another important thing about it, about the relationship. It's tenuous, is what the word is. Tenuous. Tenious. Means that there's some stress in the relationship between philosophy and Christianity, and in the first 300 years. And I'll talk to you about, and if you think about it, everybody in the class knows what happened after the first 300 years, and you know it. So it's Constantine. He makes Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, and Christians then become the custodians of philosophy, which means that they held all of the writings. Christians were responsible for preserving philosophy from 300 on through for thousands of years, up until the pre-modern era. In the Reformation, when the printing press was born, and philosophical works could be printed and preserved by anyone. That's a very important point that I'm going to press right now. So we are now at the section in your notes, if you write it down, the rejection by all ancient philosophers. Now, these philosophers were writing between about 100 CE to 300 CE. All of them, this is very important, all of the philosophers I'm about to talk about are preserved in Christian writings. What does that mean? It means that Christians like Origen and Tertullian and Justin Martyr and Augustine, they knew that the philosophers were not were writing against Christianity, and these Christians quoted the philosophers. Now, these quotes are the only place where these philosophers exist. There's no independent, preserved writing against Christianity, um, largely because the Christians destroyed them. Whenever Christians came into libraries, they destroyed stuff that wasn't Christian, so or that wasn't acceptable to them. Uh, and that's why it's very important when we find ancient libraries that were not uh, that were spared. And one of them is Nag Hammadi, and it had Gnostic writings in it. And we found out that the Christian apologists that I'm about to cite, the same guys, Augustine, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, these church fathers that we revere, whenever they talk about Gnostics, it does not match the Gnostic writings that were found. So it's entirely possible that this is inaccurate, but it's the only thing that we have. So there are 5. So just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in your notes. Philosophers that rejected Christianity. The first one is Celsus, Celsus. The second one is Lucian, Lucian. Number 1 is Celsus, Celsus. Lucian, Lucian. The next one is Macarius Magnus, and I just want you to write M period, capital M period, his first initial, Magnus, Magnes. The reason for that is you don't need to know this guy. I don't think he's very important. He just repeats, the thing is, he just repeats what Lucian says. So he's not very important. Number 4, Heracles, Heracles, Hierocles. Heracles. Now, there's an ancient Heracles. This is not him. There's more than one Heracles that wrote. This is Sosanius Heracles, and you don't need to know that. But he's a Roman aristocrat who lived in the 300s CE. The last one is Julian. That's the Emperor Julian. Julian. He lived in. He was emperor from 361 to 63, and he wrote against the Galileans, to work against the Galileans, the people from Galilee, and that means against the Christians. So I'm going to go over these with you. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek philosopher who is preserved in the Christian writer Origen. He wrote a little treatise against the Christians. A little book against the Christians. It's only like 1 page, and he basically thinks that, and actually a lot of people think this. A lot of these guys think the same thing, that Christians are basically, this is what you need to write down, Christians are apostate Jews. Apostate. 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 Maybe I'm spelling it from memory, guys, and it's late, so y'all can figure out how to spell apostate. You know what it means, because it's in our, I think it's in our vocabulary list for Macbeth. Apostate simply means unfaithful. They betrayed Judaism. Now, incidentally, this is what Jews think about Christians, that we abandon the Jewish faith. Well, philosophers think that the Gentile Christians forsook philosophy. So both sides hated Christians, and Christians hated them. For some Christians hated them. The good ones did. And then you have Lucian, who wrote against another one against the Christians, preserved in Tertullian and Eusebius. We have a little bit more of Lucian, but he ridicules Christianity. And then Heracles, number 4, the Roman aristocrat. Now this is really cool. He compared Jesus to Apollonius. It's like, guys, Apollonius of Tyana to Jesus. So he took someone that's revered in Roman, by the Romans, and basically argued that Christians created Jesus Christ, patterning after Apollonius of Tyana. Now, I looked into this, and I read these stories about Tyana, and it's very compelling. It's really humbling to read that. I don't think there's any credibility at all in it, but it is interesting. And this is a pattern. You need to know this comparing Jesus to Apollonius. And that's Apollonius. Apollonius of Tyana. You need to know this because a lot of people think that Christians just made up Jesus. And the argument isn't followed by, well, who did they make him up about? Who did they use as a pattern? Well, they think that this hero is the one, or Heracles thinks that this hero is the person that Christians used to pattern Jesus. They just copied. There's people that think that Christians copied Julius Caesar, which is really, really weird, or a Greek god like Isis, and I think it's Isis and Osiris. It's like a mother figure and a son figure, like the Virgin Mary and Christ, and Dionysius, the Greek wine god. Jesus being wine, the blood being wine. Man, I'm sorry if I'm rambling. I don't think I am. But anyway, a lot of people think that Christians just made up Jesus and patterned Jesus after someone. And this Heracles guy is the first person to argue that. And it's been followed by a lot of people. And Julian is important because he was a Roman emperor, and he was trying to use his work against the Galileans to enforce persecutions. He was trying to make a case to his supporters in the Senate to kill Christians. And so this is one of the things that was used to do that. So we know of 5 philosophers that encounter Christianity at the early, before Constantine, and all of them are negative. So it's no surprise that an influential philosopher is going to find something wrong with Christianity and beat us over the head with it. And that's what Bertrand Russell does. I also want to note, this can be a side note, the tenuous relationship between Christianity and philosophy continues today. We have a long tradition of Christians embracing philosophy and trying to use it to build a theology. Most Christians take Plato, but Christians are, every Christian thinker is influenced by someone, and usually it's other thinkers. And so, there's been a long effort to Christianize different types of philosophy, and it usually doesn't work. So, Bertrand Russell considered himself an atheist in popular settings. Like, he doesn't mind it if anybody at the table calls him an atheist, but he's actually philosophically an agnostic. The reason why he calls himself an agnostic is because he knows that he cannot argue a negative thesis. In other words, he knows that he cannot argue that God doesn't exist because that's a negative thesis. There's no proof. You know, class, that you have to prove your point. You can't prove a negative. So he considers himself philosophically an agnostic, but in reality he's an atheist. Um, you know, might as well be an atheist because he doesn't believe, he's so unconvinced by all of the arguments for God. So the first thing he does in his essay is he defines what he thinks a Christian is. And basically he comes to the conclusion that a Christian is someone who has some kind of belief about Jesus. Or he actually says Christ, because he thinks that, people think that there's a Jesus of history, like a Jesus that actually exists, and also a Christ of religion. Like, we don't really believe in the historical Jesus. We believe in the Christ of faith. The Christ that people just kind of make up. So there's kind of some truth to that. People think a lot of things about Jesus that are false. But, of course, as Christians, we believe that, Jesus is Jesus Christ. The historical Jesus is the Christ of faith. So, anyway, that's why he says some kind of belief about Christ and not some kind of belief about Jesus. So that's neither here nor there at this point, but that's why he says it. He has some kind of belief about Christ, and Russell goes for the lowest common denominator, and he says that Christ, if not divine, was the very best and wisest of men. So he says the reason why he's not a Christian, he's going to address his definition of what Christian is. And so he's going to say first why he doesn't believe in God and in immortality. But immortality is almost irrelevant if you don't believe that there's a God. So why he doesn't believe in God, and secondly, why does he not think that Christ was the best and wisest of men? Even though Russell says that he has a high degree of moral goodness. And I think that Russell lives up to that. He does believe that Christ has a lot of moral goodness, he's just not the best. But we'll get to that. So, there are different arguments that the Catholic Church traditionally has used to prove that God exists. Now, there's one key thing that the Church has taught. It's a Catholic doctrine, and I think that most reformers have been mature enough to abandon this idea. But Christians painted a huge target on their back by saying that you can come to a belief in God using unaided reason. Like, just by reason alone, just with your noggin, you can come to belief that there's a God. Now, many of you have realized that you need faith to experience God. Your noggin can enrich your belief, but if you just try to get to God with your noggin, we're all sinful people, and because of that, we have limits. We're not divine. We don't even have access to divine without Jesus. So that's something that I believe. That's why a lot of people lose their faith. They think that they can come to God just with their reasoning, and once they see some kind of reasoning that goes against what they believe, they abandon their faith because it's the only thing they believe they can do. So, this is something that can really help you in your walk with God, is knowing and confessing that access to God requires faith. So whenever you encounter something that really challenges you, you know that you came to God in faith in the first place, and you remain in God through faith, through the grace of God. So, our noggins help us, but it's not that great. So, anyway, but if you believe that you can access God through, and especially the teachings of God or the goodness of God through unaided reasoning, you're in for a big challenge, because most people that reason don't think that the Christian God exists. So you'd have to argue with all of those people. But anyway, so he writes, this is the reason why Russell can attack Christianity. It's because Christians have made a target of themselves by believing that the existence of God can be proved with unaided reason. That's like with nothing but reason alone. So that's why he can attack Christianity, and that's the kind of Christianity he's attacking. So there are 5 arguments concerning the existence of God that Russell attacks, and I have believed in all of these, before I went to seminary, and I think that the ontological argument for God is the best argument, but because I know and confess that I go to God by faith, it doesn't matter that none of these arguments work, because I know that my relationship with God is a conviction. It's something, relationship with the Holy Spirit. All that stuff you hear. So, okay, first argument, the first cause. Whenever we talked about this before, I think that I'm confident that everybody understands this, but so I'm going to be very, very brief. The first cause argument means that everything must have a cause. That's the first precept in first cause. Everything must have a cause. And if you trace all those causes back, you finally find God. God is the original cause. So Russell basically just dismisses this argument by saying cause isn't what it used to be. You remember he's using analytical philosophy, which attacks the language of the argument. So, he's saying that the language, the cause, is not what it used to be. And, the definitive going back is something that is just untenable now. You just can't do it. And he reasons that there's no reason to assume that there ever was a beginning. Now, that goes back to, I think it's called string theory. This is something I was taught whenever I was in college. He says there's no reason to assume there ever was a beginning. Well, that's because he believes in the Big Bang. There's the Big Bang theory. Okay, so you have the point in time where everything's crushed together. You have the bang, and I'm trying to watch my hands. There's limit. There's belief that there's a limit to how far it can expand, and once it hits that limit, it all comes back. So there's another Big Bang, and then another one after that, another Big Bang. So that's why Russell can say there's no reason to assume that there ever was a beginning, because he believes that the universe is constantly, the Big Bang's constantly hitting the edge of the universe and coming back in. So that's why he says that. And then natural law. Natural law is pretty self-explanatory. It just means that you can look at nature and understand, because nature operates a certain way, which is the law. Nature operates a certain way, therefore there is a God that created it like that. Now, he makes a really good point here about Newton versus Einstein. Before Einstein, Newtonian physics ruled physics, and Einstein completely redefined it. With Newton, everything was simple, and gravity was simple, and time was simple, and you could observe nature in a very orderly way. But with Einstein, in learning about how atoms work, they don't really follow laws. You have gravity, but it can bend. You can bend time, and you can that E equals mc squared. It is, there's a saying, God played dice in the dark. You know, um, it's just awesome what Einstein did to physics. And even now we have quantum physics, where you have so many things able to happen at the same time, which is really, really cool. But, I know people that have stopped being Christians because of this stuff. So, he says, and this is really good too, he says that natural laws are a description of how things behave. And because it's just a description, you can't argue that there must be someone that told it to work like that. It's like, what? You can't take something, you're describing something. You're not actually understanding it. You're just describing what you're observing. So it's a leap to think that someone created it that way. And then he argues that sorry, I have to consult my notes for a second. Okay, and then he says that natural law really, it doesn't require a creator, it doesn't really require God. And he said, but even if it did, suppose that God does exist. If God does exist, then natural law couldn't even prove it that it exists. And the reason why is because when God works and when God moves, one of two things happens. Either God interrupts natural law, which defeats the argument, because when God works, he doesn't follow the laws of nature. He's not natural. So if the natural law is supposed to prove that God exists, then it defeats its own purpose, because God exists outside of the natural law. So whenever God acts, he breaks the law. It's just a brilliant critique of the natural law. I hope that makes sense. You're arguing. If someone argues that you can observe the way nature works, and you come up with this description about how nature works, and you say, oh, because I can describe it like this, God exists. I mean, you can see a fallacy in that thinking, right? But even if you proved it, even if there wasn't a fallacy, even if you said, it's a law of nature that when you drop a ball, it always falls to the ground. Therefore, God made it like that. Well, if God made it like that, then he violated that law. He violated the law of nature. It's no longer a natural law. It's something that it's by nature divine. It's divine. It comes from God. It's not natural. So God does not serve as the ultimate lawgiver. If God is bound, but if you somehow think, well, God is not violating the law of nature, well, then God is subject to the law of nature. Thank you, Bertrand Russell. Okay, and that's why we believe in God. We believe by faith that God exists, and we can worship God and thank God for making things, for making nature. But going the other way around and trying to get to God through observing nature without any faith, it's not going to happen. Okay. Or according to Bertrand Russell, it's not going to happen. And then the argument from design. Now, this has changed a lot. I mean, we're talking about the argument from design in 1920, whenever he made this lecture. But the fundamental principles haven't changed. And for the argument from design, what you need to know is everything in the world is made just so we can manage to live in the world. Now, I've heard this argument a lot, where a preacher will say, um, the Earth is the perfect distance from the sun. If it was just a little bit closer, it would be too hot, and if it was a little bit further away, it would be too cold. And, this perfect design, it proves that God exists. And the thing is, that Russell points out is, this kind of thing is easy to parody because people that talk about this kind of thing will just point out anything and say it's designed, to benefit mankind. And or I bet you can remember, people used to say that um, rabbits had white tails to make them easier to shoot. And let's see, the other one was, I can't remember the other one. I didn't write it down. Obviously, wasn't that important. But yeah, Voltaire said the nose was made for spectacles. It was like perfectly made for spectacles. And then you remember that fiasco that I told you about, the Christian that argued that because they could hold a banana, God made the banana perfect to be, perfect for the human hand, made it with a perfect peel, and you could peel it off, and then you can eat it. You know, and that bananas like that were genetically modified, by the old genetics where you plant stuff and you seed stuff, and I don't know how they did it, but the plantation owners, French plantation owners, wanted to sell this fruit, so they kept on cultivating it to where it could be what it is today. Bananas used to be about the size of your fist and taste terrible. And now, because the planters created it like that, and this happened like in the 1800s, I think, and you know that's how you got the banana. It wasn't God that just created the banana like that in the Garden of Eden, and created it just for man. So anyway, God gave us gifts and intelligence, and we can occasionally use that to better our lives. So that's what happened with banana. Anyway, the argument from design is easy to parody. It changes, and that's a key thing. Russell points out that all these arguments change over time, and they started out with fallacies, he says, and they continue with fallacy. So this one is pretty easy to see through. And then he uses Darwin. He argues that living creatures are adapted to their environment rather than not the other way around. We know from observing nature, according to Darwin, that animals like frogs and turtles and fish, moths, human beings, we adapt to our environment and not the other way around. The environment wasn't created for us. So he argues, and the proof is very compelling. His proof is this world here. Even though you can point out things that look like they are designed, like your eyeball is very complex, and therefore people argue God designed it like that. The counter argument to that is extremely significant. The world is not the best it can be. What about all? Basically, what about all the dysfunctional things that we can look at and say, well, why wasn't it designed perfectly, like the eye? Why are things wrong and messed up? And one of the things that I thought of instantly, and maybe you'll think of it too, we live in a sinful world. Sin affected everything. So, we have this kind of skewed, we were talking about earlier about the natural laws. We have nature, all of nature is not the way it should be because of sin. In the Christian teachings, we live in a fallen world, and God will redeem the whole world. But for the time being, if we look at design with unaided reason, because of that presence of sin in the world, um, we can't get to a conclusion that God exists. I mean, using unaided reason. So Bertrand Russell demonstrates, because you look at all this other stuff. You can point out a beautiful sunrise, but what about all the human deformities? What about pollution? What about uh, whenever lions eat their cubs? There are things that you can't as easily point to in this fallen world. You can't as easily point to it and say, "Thank you, God, for designing it like this." Now, by faith, God has revealed to us that we live in a sinful, fallen world, and praise God, uh, He's going to redeem it and make it perfect. And whenever the perfection happens, all these arguments are going to go away. But for us, we need to look at the world and listen with humility when people criticize Christianity, because this is what they see. They see this argument from design, and they don't have what we have. Um, you know, this world they know is in decay. Uh, they're not ready to admit all the time that it's because of fallen humanity, but because we know that, we can listen. Okay, moral arguments for deity. This is more good stuff. Good as in it's challenging. Um, the one thing that he argues against is the point that there would be no right or wrong unless God existed. Now, trying to just reduce it because I know I've been talking for a while. Okay, this is basically the same idea that we had in the law of nature, argument. The moral argument for deity is there's no right or wrong unless God existed. Well, it's just like God acting in nature, and it rendering the natural argument useless. If God is the reason why there's right and wrong, um, kind of it obviates. This is really hard to explain. Let's see. Okay, I'm just going to read you what he says, and I'm going to read you the simplest sentence that I can find. If the difference between right and wrong is due to God's doing, he says fiat, F-I-A-T in the original, then for God himself there's no difference between right and wrong, and it is no longer a significant statement to say that God is good. So, basically, we're arguing that God is above right and wrong. No matter what God does, it's right. But then there's no difference between right and wrong. So hopefully that will suffice for the moral argument. So, to repeat, in the moral argument, the one form that he argues against is the theory that there would be no right or wrong unless God existed. And he argues that if that's actually an act of God, whatever God does is right because God is good, then there really is no difference between right and wrong. So you can't argue. That's a non-argument. And you know what? It might be still. This is something, and along with many other things here that we're talking about, it can be true, and you can be unable to argue it using pure reason. And the rationale for that is didn't originate in reason. The existence of God comes from revelation. The knowledge of the existence of God. In other words, God has to tell us. If God didn't tell us, if God didn't reveal God's self, if God didn't inspire, someone to write Genesis, and if God didn't reveal Himself through Jesus Christ. We wouldn't know that it'd be impossible to know from looking at the fallen world, from looking at the fallen world through natural law, from looking at the difference between right and wrong. Russell is saying, you know, there's no way to get there. And, we can say as Christians, that's what we've been saying since the beginning. You can't get there unless you have faith. So, let's see. The argument for remedying of justice. And this is something I think he really defeats handily. I've never heard this argument before, but evidently it's important enough for him to address back in the 20s. The existence of God. Okay, this is the argument for the remedying of justice. And we only have one more point, I believe, after this. The existence of God is required in order to bring justice into the world. In other words, in order to have justice, God has to exist. Now, his argument, it sounds great. It sounds good, and I believe it. There's no justice without God. But the problem with that argument is there's so much injustice. When you look at the world, you don't even have to leave the United States. There is no justice. So therefore, from that argument, God doesn't exist. If the existence of God is required to bring justice in the world, there is no justice, there is no God. According to that, if you follow the argument logically. And he said, he used an example of someone, experiencing an injustice. And he says, here we find in this world a great deal of injustice, and so far that is reason for supposing that justice does not rule in the world. And therefore, so far as it goes, it affords a moral argument against the deity and not in favor of one. There really isn't a good argument to say that the existence of God is required to bring justice in the world. It might be true, but it's very difficult to argue it using reason. Okay, especially if you don't believe God exists in the first place. Anyway, okay. And then he kind of belittles Christianity at the end of this section. He says that he knows, look, and this is true for me. It's true for me. He says, I know that people don't believe in God because of these arguments. He's saying, people believe in God because they were raised that way at their mother's knee, and they receive faith that way. Now, what he's missing is, between growing, being told by your mommy that God exists and learning those Bible stories whenever you're a child, and becoming an adult and reading this essay, you have however many years. You guys have 14 years. I have 35 or 6, I can't remember, and a PhD, and I have 36 years of experience that is valuable, and you have 14 years of experience with God, hopefully. You have experiences, and these experiences are just as important as these logical arguments. But he kind of belittles it. He says most people believe in God because they have been taught from early infancy to do it, and that is the main reason. Experience just doesn't even matter. And he's sort of right. Within the context of a logical argument, experience is nothing. It just doesn't matter that much, unless your experience is as an authority on something. Like you have a PhD or you've been studying something for 20 years. That makes you an authority, so your experience matters. But usually it doesn't matter. So anyway, character of Christ. Now this is something that hit me like a wrecking ball whenever I read it. And whatever, even sometimes I read this essay a lot. I used to read. There's a book. It's entitled "Why I'm Not a Christian and Other Essays," and I used to read that book at the beginning of every term, so I could remember other points of view, and I can remember to listen and humble myself and know that my arguments can be defeated by other people, and their experience can inform me. So this is something that matters a lot to me. So anyway, the character of Christ. He doesn't think that Christ was the best and wisest of men, but he respects Christ, and I think he is serious about this. And the problem is, he obeys Christ better than a lot of Christians do, and that hurts. Somebody he didn't even believe that Jesus ever existed, but he believes that he believes that he follows these teachings better than most Christians. So these teachings mostly deal with pacifism. We said earlier that Russell was a very well-known pacifist, and I know I'm at an hour, so bear with me. He's a pacifist, so he takes the pacifist scriptures and he says, Christians don't follow these, but I do. And if you think about it, Christians had been just fighting World War I, whenever he just started it at Cambridge. World War II, Christians dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, and they, in both wars, World War I and World War II, in Vietnam, the U.S. government exploited Christian beliefs, and Christians exploited each other, to try and get people to fight, and the Germans did it too. They used Christianity as a means to galvanize countries to fight and to kill people. When Jesus says, and I'll just quote this, "Resist not evil, but whoso shall smite thee on the right cheek," hit you on the right cheek, "turn to him the left also." Now, he said, if you think that you can go and hit the Prime Minister of Britain, he's probably not going to turn the other cheek. And then he says, "Judge not, yes, lest you be judged." And this one hurts. "Give to him that asks of thee, and from him that would borrow, do not turn them away." These are hard teachings, and most Christians don't follow them. And I bet that you've even heard preachers talk about, turning the other cheek. It doesn't apply to countries. It's just from person to person, and it's limited. Jesus didn't put any limits on this. I mean, this is hard discipleship stuff. I'm not a pacifist, but I have to struggle with this text. Turning the other cheek. I don't know if I would be able to do it. But he said Gandhi was able to do it, and only truly exceptional Christians are able to be pacifists. And then he says, it's not something that's common. And then he caps it off with probably one of the most difficult texts in the Bible. "If you will be perfect, go and sell all what you have and give it to the poor." It challenges a rich young man to do that. This is something that I have to just sit back and take. He's criticizing all Christians because of our inability to follow the very, very best of Jesus, and that's tough. I don't know if you think you can do these things, but it's extremely difficult. And I have to tell him, I'm trying, but I don't know if I can. Defects in Christ's teachings. The one defect that he points out that really sticks out is Jesus' belief in hell, and he believes that hell is inhumane. And a lot of people believe this, that uh, if you do something, anything that you do on earth is just temporary, therefore it's inhumane to believe that that you can receive an eternal punishment. And this has caused, a lot of Christian churches don't believe in hell anymore. And the ones that do are often, they often never talk about it, or they talk about it too much, or they qualify it. I heard in seminary, there's a lot of churches now that think that hell is not an eternal place. It's fire destroys, is what they teach. Hellfire. God in His perfect wisdom will punish someone as long as they need to, and then destroy them. That's what is a modern exception in the teaching about hell. Most churches have either stopped talking about it, they don't believe it, or they just say it all the time, and that's almost as bad as not believing it. So, anyway, that's what he finds. That's the primary fault that he finds about Jesus. So, the question on an exam: what is the primary fault that Bertrand Russell finds with Jesus? Jesus believes in hell. Um, and then there's the other thing about the issue about people thinking that Jesus is going to come back soon. In Jesus' teachings, it looks like he believes that the end is near, and it's been 2,000 years. And then, excuse me, excuse me, it's pretty late. And then take no thought for tomorrow and the second coming. So that is all I have for you guys. You survived, hopefully. That was a lecture, and it will be your only one. So enjoy it, and I will see you soon.